In the spring of 2003, I graduated high school and had a scholarship lined up at a nearby community college. I decided to get a summer job in order to make some extra money before I started my freshman year. As it happened, a friend of my dad's worked as a caretaker at a local cemetery, but he was taking a couple of months off in order to recover from a back surgery. Duke, my dad's friend, told me his son, Brian, who was about my age, had already volunteered to fill in as a temporary daytime caretaker, but if I was interested, he had another job I might like. I asked him what it was, and he told me. Nightwatchmen. Apparently, there had been several other cemeteries in the area that had been vandalized recently, probably the work of teenagers. And Duke needed someone to guard the cemetery between 8 p.m. when it closed to the public and 5 a.m. when his son Brian would show up for his job. Duke told me it wasn't an official county position, but he was willing to pay me out of his own pocket to do it. I was a little hesitant at first to accept the job. I'm not someone who spooks very easily, but the thought of being alone in a deserted cemetery at night for 9 hours did kind of give me the creeps. But I didn't really have anything else lined up for the summer, and it sounded like it would beat flipping burgers at McDonald's, so I shrugged and said sure, why not? The cemetery where I would be working was on the outskirts of the town where I lived, out in the country, surrounded by sprawling, wide-open farmlands on 3 sides. The back of the cemetery ended at the edge of a small woods. It was a pretty big area, maybe 6 acres, and was one of the oldest cemeteries in town, with graves dating back to the early 1800s. Now I drove out there one warm afternoon in early June for my first shift, and I was greeted by Duke, who was waiting for me near the entrance. He spent the next hour or so giving me a tour of the grounds and explaining what my job duties would consist of. Basically, I would give the whole cemetery a sweep every hour and write down any unusual activity, whatever that was, that I might encounter. And if I did find anyone trespassing, I shouldn't confront them. I should call the police instead. He took me into a small shed off to one side near the front. The place was crammed with tools and gardening equipment. There was a small desk with a chair and a notebook on it for me to log my reports, and a big flashlight, the long kind that takes 4D batteries to power. As soon as Duke finished showing me around, his face suddenly turned serious. He told me he had something he wanted me to see, and took out a ring of keys from his pocket. I watched, intrigued, as he unlocked a tall metal container against one wall and opened it. I gasped. Inside stood a 12-gauge shotgun and a box of shells. Duke held the locker open for a few seconds to show me the shotgun. Then he closed it and relocked it. He explained to me that the shotgun was only for extreme emergencies, and that he didn't want me to touch it unless I felt sure that my life was in danger. He went on to say that you never know who might show up at a cemetery after dark. Usually it was harmless stuff, bored kids looking for a place to drink and screw around. But cemeteries also tended to be the hangout spot for all kinds of weirdos. Satanists, drug addicts, sometimes even grave robbers. Seeing my look of concern, he gave me a reassuring smile and told me it wasn't likely I would run into any of those types of people on the job. But he wanted me to know about the shotgun just in case. Then he removed the locker key from the keyring and handed it to me. By then, late afternoon had given way to early evening, and the sun had began to set. And Duke had pretty much shown me everything and told me everything that I needed to know. So we shook hands, and then he left to go home. I watched as he got into his pickup truck and drove down the driveway, through the cemetery gate and onto the road, disappearing from sight. I suddenly realized that I was all alone in a deserted cemetery miles from anywhere, and it was starting to get dark. And I shuddered in spite of myself. I looked at my watch and saw it was nearly 8 p.m., and the start of my first shift. And I figured there was maybe an hour of daylight left or so. Now I did my first check of the cemetery grounds, beginning at the front, which is the newer section, and finishing at the rear, the older part of the cemetery. And this part of the cemetery was especially creepy. Many of the gravestones were cracked and leaning, eroded by the elements. Several of the plots had a sunken look to them. Duke had explained to me earlier when giving me the tour that this was caused by the soil settling on top of the old caskets as they deteriorated and collapsed underground. Again, I shuddered at the thought. The back of the cemetery ended at an embankment that sloped down to a shallow creek, with the woods beginning on the other side. And at the bottom of the embankment was a heap of old, rotting flowers and wreaths from the graves. I figured Duke must dump them there after they began to dry out and fall apart. My whole inspection only took about 15 minutes, so I headed back to the maintenance shed to kill some time before the next one. And I propped my feet up on the desk and pulled out a paperback Stephen King book I had brought along to help pass the time. And this was 2003, a long time before smartphones came along. I read, absorbed in the harrowing ordeal of the Torrance family in the creepy Overlook Hotel. And before I knew it, 9 o'clock had rolled around. And I put down my book, picked up my flashlight, and headed outside to patrol the grounds. And it was fully dark now, and I could hear crickets. And I strolled through the cemetery, starting again at the front and working my way to the back, casually aiming my flashlight around. And I had just reached the rear of the cemetery when something happened. I stopped, listening, and suddenly felt alert. I heard something. I cocked my head to listen, and I could hear a very faint scraping sound, and soft and slow and steady. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I shined my flashlight all around, but I could see nothing out of the ordinary. Just as abruptly as the sound had begun, it stopped. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably some animal, a raccoon or possum or something, scratching at the bark of a nearby tree. Finishing my inspection, I returned to the shed and picked up my book. And I spent the next half hour or so reading and was just at the part where the little boy Danny encounters the rotting, naked old woman in the bathtub, when I heard something outside that caused me to jump to my feet, knocking over my chair in the process. And footsteps. Slow, labored, shuffling footsteps that sounded like they were moving around just outside the shack. My heart began to race, and I stood there petrified with sudden fear. And it was nighttime, and the cemetery was closed, and there shouldn't be anyone out there. And I remembered what Duke had said about the teenage trespassers. And I waited, hardly even daring to breathe, my pulse racing, listening. And the footsteps seemed to circle around the shack 2 or 3 times, then gradually faded off into the distance. Silence resumed. And I waited there for several minutes, too scared to investigate. I glanced at the locker with a shotgun inside it, but remembered Duke told me not to touch it unless I was in danger. It was probably just some local kids who came to have an underage drinking party, or a teen couple looking for a place to make out. Except the cemetery was 5 miles out of town, and I hadn't heard any cars pull up outside. And I stood there for the better part of 5 minutes, scared and undecisive. And finally, I told myself I was being a chicken and I needed to man up. Protecting the cemetery from trespassers was, after all, my job. And it was probably some harmless old drunk or a drifter looking for a place to crash for the night. And I summoned my courage, picked up my flashlight, then opened the shed door to step outside. And it was full dark now and totally pitch black. And thick dark clouds blotted out the moon and stars, and the only illumination came from my flashlight. Cautiously, I began a sweep of the cemetery. There was no sign of any intruder, and nothing looked out of place. But I could still somehow sense that something was wrong, different. It took a couple of minutes for me to place it. And it was quiet. It was too quiet. Dead quiet. The crickets had stopped chirping. An unnatural hush had fallen over the cemetery like a blanket. The only sound was my breathing. Besides that, it was silent as a grave. And I felt like I was being watched. I had read that cliche expression in 1,000 bad horror stories and never believed it before then, but at that moment, alone in the dark, in the middle of the night, in that unnaturally silent cemetery, I did. It seemed like I could sense a dozen sets of predatory eyes boring into me, observing my every move, so strong it was almost a physical sensation. I was scared shitless. And I stopped in my tracks abruptly, tensing and cocking my head. I had heard something, but what was it? And I listened closer. Faintly, I could hear that same soft, persistent scraping sound from before. I looked around trying to pinpoint its location and source. It seemed to be coming from directly ahead of me to my right. I cautiously moved on, tracking the sound, which seemed to get slightly louder the closer I got. I was in the newer section of the cemetery, the part still in use. And I stopped in front of a new grave where the sound seemed to be the loudest. I trained my flashlight upon the marble headstone, and it belonged to an elderly woman who had died a couple weeks before. The mound of soil in front of the headstone was still brown and bare of grass from her recent burial. I listened and realized the sound was coming from below the ground, below the grave. And I felt a chill as cold as ice water rise from the pit of my stomach up to my heart. And I tried convincing myself it was probably just a gopher or some other small animal burrowing through the earth. Then something happened. And I felt a tremor and I heard the rumble of falling soil. Earthquake, I thought for a split second, but it only seemed to be coming from the fresh grave before me. Nowhere else. Then, the rectangle of bare, mounded earth collapsed inward, and almost in slow motion, looking like the roof of an elevator car descending its shaft. It happened in no more than 5 seconds. And I stood there, transfixed in shock, before a gaping black hole that only seconds before had been a full grave. And it took a few moments for my brain to process what had just happened. My mind was freaking out, screaming at me to run, but my body didn't listen. As scared as I was, some part of me was also curious. And some part of me had to see, seemingly not of their own accord, my feet stepped to the edge of the sunken grave, and I shined my flashlight down. The beam centered on a casket lying askew at the bottom of a pit that was at least 15 feet deep, much deeper than a grave, more like a mine shaft, with drifts of dirt all around it. And as I watched, the casket was moving and scooting along the bottom of the shaft inch by inch, scraping through the dirt. And I moved the beam of my flashlight off to the other side of the casket, and What I saw is something that still haunts me to this day. There was a gaping black hole of an entrance in the side of the pit, and a pair of thin, gray arms with unnaturally long fingers and long black claws-like fingernails protruding from the hole, clutching the foot of the casket, dragging it into the tunnel a little at a time. And that's when I turned and ran back to the shed, panting in terror. And I reached in my pocket for my phone to call the police, but it wasn't there. I must have left it on the desk in the shed. I ran back to the shed. Reaching it, I went through the door and I froze. The inside of the shed was in shambles, and everything had been trashed. Tools were scattered across the floor, and the desk and chair had been turned over, and my paperback had been torn to shreds. My cell phone had also been torn to shreds. Someone had been in the shed while I had been outside, or something. And I stood there taking in the destruction. And then I heard a sound coming from behind me. The same shuffling footsteps that I had heard before. I seemed to regress in age, and I seemed to regress in age in a matter of seconds, reduced to the surreal, almost wondrous state of terror that a child in the grip of a nightmare may have. And a figure stood in front of the doorway, only a few feet outside of the shed. And it was cast in a shadow, only a silhouette, but I could see it was tall and thin, and unnaturally long, with skinny arms that hung down nearly to its feet. Its eyes were red, and I could see them glinting in the dark like embers. And they were staring right at me. And we stood there for what felt like an eternity, regarding each other. And then the shadowy figure took a step towards the door. And I darted forward, slammed the door shut, and turned the lock. There was an unnaturally high-pitched, chittering screech from outside. It sounded more animal than human. The creature began to pound wildly against the shed door. And I jumped, as something else slammed against the rear of the shed. And I could hear claws scratching against the wood, as if something was trying to burrow through the wall. Something else slammed into the side of the shed. And there were more than one of them, and they were all trying to break into the shed at the same time. Trying to break in and get me. And that was when I remembered the shotgun. I looked to the metal locker, still upright but now leaning askew against one corner. And I frantically searched the pockets of my jeans until I found the key Duke had given me. With shaking hands, I unlocked the locker and grabbed the shotgun, hoping it was loaded. I had never touched a gun in my life, and I had no idea how to load one, and there wasn't enough time anyways. I fumbled ineptly with it for a few seconds until I figured out how to get the safety off. The banging and screeching was coming from all around me. It sounded like the shed was surrounded on all four sides. And I pumped the shotgun like I'd seen it done in the movies, then aimed my shaking hands at the door, clenched my teeth, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was louder than anything I could have ever imagined, and the kickback was so powerful, it almost knocked me backwards. The next morning I would find an ugly bruise on my right shoulder, where the stock of the shotgun had struck me. And a ragged hole the size of a fist materialized in the door. For a split second after I fired the shotgun, and I thought I detected a high-pitched shriek of pain outside the shed door. And then I couldn't hear anything but a ringing in my ears. For a few seconds, I feared I had gone deaf from the blast. And then slowly my hearing returned. I knew because I could hear my own ragged breathing, and otherwise there was silence. The screeching and banging had ceased. I listened intently, my heart pounding, but I heard nothing. Then cautiously, still clutching the shotgun, I crept to the battered shed door, unlocked it, and threw it open at the same time leveling the shotgun. There was nothing there but blackness. I fled the shed, running in an all-out sprint for my car. I leapt in, locked the doors, started the engine, and took off, slamming down the gas pedal. and I sped down the driveway, my tires screeching and sending gravel flying. And I shot through the gate, then turned onto the highway back to town. But just before I drove through the gate, I saw, or thought I saw, one last thing in my rearview mirror. Several pairs of glowing red eyes in the darkness behind me. My phone had been destroyed, so I drove to the sheriff's office when I reached town and told them I had been attacked by grave robbers. And I was scared and badly shaken, but still possessed enough sense to know they wouldn't believe me if I told them what I had really encountered in the cemetery. And after I gave my statement, they called my parents, who came and picked me up since I was still pretty rattled. My mom drove me home in their car, while my dad followed behind us in mine. And I went straight up to my room after we got back and fell into bed, but it was several hours before I managed to fall asleep. The state police came by the next day to ask me some questions, and I told them the same story. And I told them the same story I'd told the sheriff and his deputy. And I'd been doing my hourly inspection of the grounds, and surprised a couple of grave robbers who chased me back to the shed and tried breaking in. Just before I had scared them away with a shotgun Duke had showed me, and I hadn't gotten a good look at their faces, and I couldn't even tell exactly how many there had been. And the police didn't seem very satisfied with my answers, and they looked suspicious. I think they could sense I was holding something back, but they didn't press the matter and left soon after. And a couple days later, Duke stopped by the house to see how I was doing. I told him I was okay, but after my experience, I probably wouldn't be coming back to work. He seemed to understand and was apologetic about what had happened. He paid me $60 in cash for my single disastrous shift at the cemetery. I noticed that something else seemed to be bothering him. He had a troubled frown on his face and seemed disturbed, maybe even a little scared. I asked him how the police investigation at the cemetery was going. There had been a brief story about it on the local news. And I asked if they had found any clues, but he just shrugged and said that so far, there wasn't much to go on. Somehow I could sense he was lying. His answers seemed evasive, and I got the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. He left, and that was the last time I ever spoke to him. And it took over a week for me to get over my ordeal, but then I was pretty much back to normal. And I got a job working part-time at Blockbuster Video, back when that was a thing. And for the rest of the summer, I started college that fall. And after I graduated in 2007, I got a job in the city, found a decent apartment, married and had 2 kids, and it's been 18 years since that night, and I had mostly put it behind me and forgotten about it, except for the occasional bad dream. And then last month, something happened, and I had taken my family to the rural town where I grew up to visit my parents for the weekend, and just by chance I ran into Brian, Duke's son, while in town getting some groceries. He recognized me from when we had been kids. We'd never really been close friends, but he had attended the same schools growing up and belonged to some of the same social circles. And he invited me to a bar where we reminisced about old times and caught up on each other's lives over a couple of beers. And his father, Duke, had died peacefully in his sleep 8 years before, and now Brian worked in his dad's position as the cemetery groundskeeper. I asked Brian if the police ever got any leads on whoever it was that had dug up the grave and attacked me that night back in 2003. And his mood instantly changed. His face darkened and became guarded. He was silent for some time and seemed to be debating in his head whether or not he should tell me. And finally, he leaned in close. to me and made me promise I would never tell anyone what he was about to tell me. Brian explained that the police had inspected the open grave and discovered the tunnel I had seen at the bottom. They had investigated and discovered a whole network of underground tunnels running below the cemetery that looked to have been dug by hand Another tunnel entrance had been found partially concealed by undergrowth in the ditch at the bottom of the embankment near the rear of the cemetery. In the center of this subterranean tunnel system had been a large cavern which had been filled with splintered caskets, some dating back over 100 years, and bones and body parts, some still relatively fresh. The human remains had all shown signs of being devoured. I felt a chill pass through my body. Brian finished off his beer with a hard swig and set the bottle down with a trembling hand. He went on to explain that after this gruesome discovery, the police had notified the FBI, who had shown up to investigate, and after the FBI, another, more secretive government agency had gotten involved. I asked him who, but he just shook his head and told me they hadn't said, and only that their jurisdiction had superseded both state police and the FBI. They had taken over the investigation, shut down the cemetery, and had ordered everyone involved, including Duke, to stay silent with the threat of prosecution and imprisonment if they breathed a word of it to anybody. The cemetery had been closed for over a year, while men in hazmat suits had collected the bodies. And then one day, they were just gone. They left without a word, seemingly overnight, leaving no trace behind. The underground tunnels had been filled in with dirt, and after that, things had pretty much gone back to normal. Brian sat there quietly for a while, and I thought he was finished, but then he added one final detail. The morning after my night in the cemetery, after the sheriff had looked around, but before the state police had arrived to do a more thorough investigation, Brian and his dad had found something outside the shed the sheriff had overlooked. A small puddle of black liquid on the ground, outside the door I'd fired the shotgun through. Duke had figured it was probably just spilt motor oil from a bottle in the back of the shed, and told Brian to clean it up. But Brian had noticed something his dad didn't. A thin trail of the same black substance in the grass, leading away from the shed, towards the embankment in the back of the cemetery. He had been curious and collected a small sample in a jar when his father wasn't looking and mailed it to an older cousin of his who worked as a technician in the anthropology department of a university. And a couple weeks later, Brian's cousin called him. They'd analyzed the sample. They were able to determine that it was blood, but the DNA sequence wasn't like anything they'd ever seen before. They couldn't identify the blood, but whatever it wasn't human.